Not being able to communicate is so lonely. Can you imagine not being able to share um, that you like something about a sunset? Have you ever been seeing a sunset and not be able to share that with somebody? Have you ever been an aquarium, look around for your friends and you can't find them, but you see this really cool fish? Have you ever been in a conversation that you really wanted to be a part of, but they wouldn't let you enter into the conversation because they were talking so fast and you didn't know what to do to get in? Can you imagine always being in that space?
Of people having developmental and acquired speech and language disorder. Essentially, a speech disorder is difficulty producing the sounds for those words that they want to say. So in a young child, our most typical speech sound disorder that we would think of is a child who uses a w sound for R or a w sound for L. So instead of saying lollipop, they would say wowie pop. And instead of saying Roger Rabbit, they would say Waja Wabbit, because they can't produce those particular speech sounds. So that would be a speech sound disorder, developmental speech sound disorder. And so then a child who has a developmental language disorder has difficulty acquiring the meanings of words rapidly and has difficulty learning the grammatical structure of language. And so what you would hear is sentences that are much shorter than what you would expect for their age, much less grammatically accurate than you would expect for their age. So for the most part, by the time kids are 5 years of age, most of what they say is pretty grammatical. Grammatical errors are few and far between. But a child who had a developmental language disorder likely would still have a lot of grammatical errors in their sentences. So instead of saying, yesterday I jumped off my bike, they would say, yesterday I jumped off my bike. And today at school, Johnny, he pushed me down, instead of he pushed me down. Or a pilot fly an airplane rather than a pilot flies an airplane. And speech disorders and language disorders exist at many levels of severity. So you can have a very mild disorder, or you can have a very severe disorder. So a preschooler with a severe speech sound disorder is going to have difficulty with lots and lots of different sounds. And so when you listen to their speech, they are going to be very, very unintelligible and very difficult to understand. And a child with a language disorder, the more severe it is, the fewer words they have in their vocabulary, and the shorter their sentences are going to be. So I can remember a child that I worked with who was in kindergarten, and I gave her, I have a book here, that Little Red Riding Hood book, and I had her look at the pictures, and she said things like, Little Red Riding Hood, Little Red Riding Hood, go. Little Red Riding Hood, Big Bad Wolf, where Grandma? Whereas you would expect a kindergarten child to say, oh, that's a story about Little Red Riding Hood. She's going to visit her grandmother. She's taking something for her to eat. She's going to meet the big bad wolf in the woods, and then go on telling that story. So that would be a difference between a non-language impaired child and a child with a language disorder. We can take all of those kids that have difficulty learning to talk, and we can split them into two groups, kids with primary language impairments and kids with secondary language impairments. So children that we say have secondary language impairments are having difficulty learning to talk, and their difficulty is associated with some much larger syndrome or disability. So a child with cognitive impairment, for example, or a child with autism, a child with hearing loss, their speech and language learning difficulties relate to that autism, that hearing loss, that cognitive deficit. Then we have a group of children who are cognitively normal, whose structure of their mouth is perfectly fine, they have no other developmental problems, they simply have difficulty learning to talk. And those kids, we say, they have primary speech and language disorder. For primary language impairment, we now believe that most of those kids have a language impairment that's genetic in nature, and think of it, I like to think of it as a weakness in language learning that runs in their family. Much like great athletics skill can run in a family. Language is probably somewhat the same kind of thing. It just gets elevated to a more important status because your ability to talk highly influences what happens to you in the world. How well you do in school, how well you interview, and what jobs you get, what friends you have, all of those kinds of things.